Hello, viewers. This is Dr. Qamar Cheema, and I have with me Mr. Akhil Barry, who lives in Sri Lanka while sitting in Washington, and he works at a Asia Society Policy Institute. Thank you very much, Mr. Akhil, for your time for my YouTube.
Thanks for having me on again.
So, Akhil, just let me start it quickly. What do you think is going on in Sri Lanka? We have seen that the inflation have crossed 50%, and the country doesn't have the money at all, and the president had to go. So, how do you see what's going on in Sri Lanka now?
So, as you mentioned, Sri Lanka is in the midst of its worst economic crisis since independence in 1948. This crisis has been building up for a long time. So, successive governments have never successfully implemented the policies needed to reform Sri Lanka's economy or have it inserted into the global supply chain. A series of bad policy decisions by the current government, as well as external shocks such as the COVID-19 pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, really pushed Sri Lanka over the threshold, leading it to default for the first time in its history. And as you mentioned, there are no dollars left on the island. So there's been a lot of frustration on the part of the general populace at the government, at the economic crisis, because you have no fuel on the island, power cuts of up to 13 hours per day. There was a food shortage, there was a medicine shortage, and has left Sri Lanka relying on humanitarian assistance from a large range of countries. So this caused first Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa to step down, and Ranil Wickremesinghe was appointed as Prime Minister in his stead. Now, though, the protests did not dissipate because the economic conditions had not improved, and also that the general populace was frustrated with the lack of political reforms as well, which eventually led President Gotabaya Rajapaksa to step down. So he has fled the country. He is currently in Singapore, or that was the last known whereabout of him. And Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe has been appointed the acting president. So what happens next is that there are kind of two issues. One is you need a stable government to be able to negotiate with the IMF, because until there's an IMF program in place, a lot of countries are not going to be willing to loan Sri Lanka more money. So if you look at the nature of the aid that's come through, it's all humanitarian assistance. It's not the financial assistance that Sri Lanka needs. And Sri Lanka needs about $6 billion to bridge the current account deficit. The IMF program is key to unlocking this additional financing, and you need a stable government for that. The problem is, though, is that the stable government that may happen is going to be with the supporters of the Rajapaksa family, because they hold a 2/3 majority in parliament, and that's not going to appease the protesters who want a complete dismantling of the political system and introduce the political reforms that are more reflective of Sri Lanka as a society. So the next month or so, you're probably going to see the protests continue. But at the same time, on July 20th, it's expected that Parliament will vote in a new president. There are numerous candidates for the presidency, but I'm skeptical that this will kind of lead the protesters to drop their demands, because the economic crisis is going to continue.
So, Akhil, how do you see the role of China, particularly in Sri Lanka? Because we have seen that everybody's talking that the Chinese dread trap diplomacy is one factor, among so many other factors, because that's not a single most factor. So, how do you see the role of China? And before this crisis, the Chinese foreign minister was there, and so I think the Chinese were not trying to give that kind of boost to the Sri Lankan economy. They were not going to roll over the loan and all that. So how do you see, in a nutshell, the role of China in Sri Lanka?
So China is interesting because if you look at Western media, you would think that China was exclusively responsible for Sri Lanka's issues. It's not. Has it played a role in it? Yes. Has it been a responsible player in Sri Lanka? Absolutely not. So, for example, Hambantota Port, there was a feasibility study done, and it is worth noting that Hambantota was first offered to India to develop, but India did not see the commercial viability there, at which point it went to China to develop. Similarly, I mean, with all these various vanity infrastructure projects, the Rajapaksas and other governments invested in them even though there wasn't commercial viability. And it's worth remembering that that the majority of Sri Lanka's debt composition is owed to international investors. Only about 10% or 12% is owed to China. But at the same time, China has not been a helpful partner here. What does Sri Lanka need right now? So Sri Lanka is engaged in debt restructuring negotiations with all of its creditors. But the thing is when I say all creditors, that also means China. And you have your international creditors, such as your investment funds here in the U.S., that are looking to see if they have to take a haircut, they want to see China taking a haircut as well in the debt restructuring process. China's been willing to refinance the loans, but it hasn't been willing to restructure the loans. And that is actually, that I would argue, is hampering Sri Lanka's ability to get out of this fiscal crisis. Why is China acting like this? My hypothesis is because of the precedent it would set for other countries. Sri Lanka is just one of many countries that are indebted to, that have a significant portion of their debt held by the Chinese. It is worth noting that Sri Lanka's is about 10%, whereas Pakistan is 25%. So if the Chinese were to restructure Sri Lanka's debt, Pakistan would be the next one in line to say, what about us? Similarly, Zambia, Kenya, a lot of other countries would be looking for the same treatment. And so my hypothesis is that the Chinese are very concerned about the precedent it would set and are not willing to engage in, they're willing to engage in the negotiations, but they are not likely to accept the restructuring.
So, Akhil, how do you see the role of India? Because particularly we are talking that in this era of geopolitical competition, this issue of the sovereign debts, they are rising. So this economic and political collapse will have implications in the region. And how do you see the role of India? Because there was a understanding, or there was some sort of an assessment that the Chinese and the Indians are competing for a role in Sri Lanka. So how do you see that aspect?
Of course. So when the Rajapaksas came back to power in 2019, I think that was a significant blow for India because of the Rajapaksas' close relationship with China and kind of adversarial relationship with India. So when Mahinda Rajapaksa lost his third term for presidency in 2015, he actually blamed it on the Indian intelligence services for his defeat. So and the Rajapaksas have had a very close relationship with China. So India had lost out on a number of kind of initiatives in Sri Lanka under Gotabaya Rajapaksa. I mean, so canceling the Eastern Container Terminal Port project, canceling the light rail project, and also in December there was a situation where the Chinese ambassador went near Jaffna, which has been considered close to India, to launch some renewable energy projects. So there's been a large competition between China and India in Sri Lanka. But as the economic crisis has been unfolding, India has, I would argue, been able to regain some of its lost influence because it's really taken up championing Sri Lanka's cause in multilateral organizations, as well as being the first to really recognize the scope of the crisis and be willing to provide the humanitarian assistance needed. So, I mean, I remember quite clearly when the fuel crisis was on, Foreign Minister Jaishankar went to Sri Lanka and he inspected a Indian oil station there to see, okay, where are the constraints in the supply? How can we help ease the supply constraints and make sure the people of Sri Lanka get what they need? At the World Bank IMF meetings in April, Finance Minister Sitharaman was there taking up the Sri Lankan cause with Kristalina Georgieva, the managing director of the IMF, and other institutions to say, look, we need to get Sri Lanka the help it needs, to the point where various online netizens were joking that Finance Minister Sitharaman was actually Sri Lanka's finance minister, given that she was doing a lot more for Sri Lanka than the Sri Lankan government was. So India still has extended about $4 billion in humanitarian assistance, food credit lines, oil, fuel, etc., to Sri Lanka to try to help it navigate this crisis. And it is continuing to champion Sri Lanka. It's setting up a task force of how can we help Sri Lanka. So that's a task force comprised of the Foreign Secretary, Vinay Quatra, the chief economic advisor, Finance Minister Sitharaman, Foreign Minister Jaishankar, etc. So India is very concerned about what's happening in Sri Lanka and is trying to see how it can best help.
So, Akhil, how do you see the role of the global financial institutions, particularly IMF and the others? What kind of a conditions they're putting forward in front of Sri Lanka, or how they want to how they want to move forward with Sri Lanka from this situation where it is right now, which is completely disconnected with the world. They're on the verge of a societal crisis as well. Forget the economic crisis alone.
So with the IMF and other global institutions, so the World Bank has provided some financial assistance. The thing is that Sri Lanka's debt has been considered unsustainable for a long time. In 2020, when COVID was first hitting everywhere, the IMF created this program called Rapid Finance. There was a Rapid Finance Instrument program, where the IMF was just trying to get money out the door to countries as quickly as possible in order to support their economies, in order to make sure that the economies didn't collapse. At the time, Sri Lanka's debt was considered unsustainable. Though it was negotiating with the IMF on obtaining that rapid finance instrument, it was not legally qualified to, because at that point, Sri Lanka's debt was close to 100% of GDP. And there was, because of the impact of because of the impact of COVID and the crash in tourism, Sri Lanka's foreign exchange earnings were very low at the time. And you also had policies such as the 2019 tax cuts, which the IMF found that had decreased Sri Lanka's revenue by about 2.4% of GDP in lost revenue. So at that point, Sri Lanka should have been negotiating with its creditors to say, look, this is a unique situation. What help can we get? But at that time, the government did not want to approach the IMF. It thought it could muddle through the crisis. And as we've seen now, it has not been able to. So with the IMF, it's trying to negotiate. It is negotiating with Sri Lanka. And there was an interview with Kristalina Georgieva yesterday where she said, as soon as there's a stable government in place, I believe that negotiations will conclude quickly. But because Sri Lanka's debt is unsustainable, in August, there's a debt sustainability report due in August, which will kind of outline how Sri Lanka will get back to debt sustainability and be in a much better fiscal space. At which point, an IMF program will be negotiated, and it needs to be approved by the executive board because Sri Lanka's debt is unsustainable. Now, the IMF, I suspect, will ask for a few conditions. One, it will ask for increased taxes, essentially reversing the 2019 tax cuts. Also, privatization of SOEs. This has long been an issue with Sri Lanka. I mean, even Sri Lankan Airlines is bankrupt, and it is a drain on the exchequer. So I would anticipate that could be up, even though it's harsh global conditions. I would anticipate that privatization of an SOE will be on the table, and also potentially cutting the public sector, because Mona Gotabaya Rajapaksa's key campaign promises was hiring 10,000 more public sector workers. That also indicates kind of a failure of the government to create jobs, that they need to rely on the public sector to create those jobs for the general populace. So I would anticipate the IMF is going to ask them to roll that back to some degree. One angle I have been championing, and I think would be a good faith effort by Sri Lanka to show it's willing to agree to fiscal consolidation, is to cut the amount of defense spending. For where Sri Lanka is, it does not need to spend this much on defense. I think that would also help alleviate some of the international community's concerns about human rights violations by the Sri Lankan government.
So, Akhil, my last question to you is that in this era of geopolitical competitions that you mentioned earlier as well, when the Americans are talking about having forward in the Indo-Pacific, when these entire Indo-Pacific strategies are being drawn out and putting on the table, and even I think the Americans opened the embassy in Maldives recently, the previous administration, I think. How do you see this crisis or this bankruptcy of Sri Lanka should be viewed from this new competition between among the great powers?
I mean, I think that Sri Lanka is a prime opportunity of the Quad to show that the Quad can work together and deliver meaningful results for countries in crises. Because right now, I mean, don't forget, the Quad came together in the 2004 in the aftermath of the 2004 tsunami to focus on disaster relief efforts. It's focused on a number of working groups right now. For example, emerging and critical technologies, supply chain resiliency, vaccine diplomacy. But I think Sri Lanka is a way for them all to coordinate and work together to alleviate the suffering of the Sri Lankan people. It will take a lot of coordination, but I think this is a prime opportunity. Now, the U.S. is working closely together with India. It's in constant communication with its Indian counterparts about what the best course of action is. So while India has provided about $4 billion in humanitarian assistance, the U.S. is doing a much more targeted aid program. Part of this also is because the U.S. and Sri Lanka, their relations are often defined by human rights, whereas the U.S. has championed the rights of Tamils, and the Sri Lankan Sinhalese majority sees it as kind of insulting to them that they won the Sri Lankan Civil War and they don't get the credit that they deserve for it. So the U.S. and Sri Lanka have had a tested relationship, but I think now with the crisis here, there's an opportunity for the U.S. to show that it is committed to the region, that it is committed to helping, and instead of like saying great power competition, actually deliver results for the people of Sri Lanka that will engender them, the politicians, to the U.S. for the years to come.
Thank you very much, Ari, for your wonderful analysis. The crisis in Sri Lanka, time and giving your viewpoint from Washington for our viewers.
Thanks for having me on.